Recording, and we're talking about video game genres. And if you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on it. Or if you want to just talk on your mic, you can do that as well. So feel free to stop me if you have any questions or have any examples or things that you want to talk about. That's fine. So we're talking about video game genre. We're going to start by looking at genre in a couple different contexts to try to help us kind of think about how it works for video games and how it's different from other types of media like literature or film. Just kind of starting with what genre means. It's sort of a weird word, right? It's sort of hard to pronounce, but it's applied to all sorts of different media and art. And it's sort of like, well, we'll see how it influences the way that we think about games. So in a long time ago, genre was this idea of classification for different types of literature, which was, the only medium that they had back then, because they didn't have film, they didn't have video games and screens and stuff like that. And so they had performance mostly, and those performances had two different main types, which were poetry and prose. And the way that those different types of performance worked informed the types of things that you would see in those types of performances. So poetry had, meter and rhyme and the sort of musical qualities, which made poetry kind of easier to remember and easier to recite. And so you could recite a long poem to tell a story. And it was a way to kind of facilitate performance and the passing of stories between, different people and different cultures. And then prose was more of just sort of like you would give speeches in prose. So if you wanted to make an argument or you wanted to kind of address a group of people, you would use prose. So it wasn't necessarily meant to be remembered. It wasn't necessarily meant to be a narrative or a story or poetic or something like that. It was more of just a straightforward way to convey information. And so those two types of performance or speaking kind of create this idea of genre, that they're sort of like themes or conventions of the way that we communicate, of the way that we kind of create narratives or tell stories that inform the decisions that we make when we put them together. So again, like the really basic one with poetry is just rhyming. When you do rhyming, it's easy to remember things because they rhyme and it's fun. And it kind of, turns on this part of our poetic mind that helps us remember something. Like nursery rhymes, things like that. So that's a convention of the genre that comes out of basically this necessity to make things easy to remember, to make things kind of like make a big impression. And we still have that to this day. We still have nursery rhymes. We still have music that has a lot of rhyming in it, and it helps us kind of connect with those forms. So that's where the idea of genre comes from, is kind of creating these different styles and then codifying or sort of describing the conventions of those styles in order to inform how those styles work in the world. Okay, so as we talk about different media, this idea of genre sort of starts to morph depending on what that media is. There's no kind of like really hard rules for what genre is. It's not like science where we have like gravity and physics and things like that. It's more something that we debate and disagree about, but sort of create over time collectively. So again, we're going to look at a few genre distinctions in traditional mediums and then think about how they apply to video games. So we'll start with literature. We talked about prose versus poetry. There's also genres within what started as poetry. So epic poetry, tragedy, and comedy. And you guys are probably familiar with these. We still use these today when we're talking about movies and books and stuff like that. The basic conventions there, we have the epic where you have like a hero and they go on a journey and you have like episodic events through that journey. tragedy, you basically have a hero again, but they, something bad happens and they die in the end, and there's some lesson that's learned from that. Typically, comedy, same thing, except in the end we have a wedding or some happy event that happens. So these kind of conventions set up the viewer or the listener for what they expect from the experience. And then within each individual work, we can kind of play with those conventions to create the experience. Within literature and fiction, we have a lot of subgenres, and this kind of applies to like what we were talking about last week with game settings. But these are specific to literature, where we have like, again, sort of like these niche subgenres that have different conventions. So things like drama, fables, fantasy, literary novels and short stories, folklore, historical fiction, horror, humor, mystery, mythology, realism, science fiction. All of these different subgenres kind of combine different conventions with more specific expectations. In nonfiction, we have other subgenres like autobiography, biography, essay, narrative nonfiction, etc. These have their own conventions. Specifically, within nonfiction, the convention is that the things that we're talking about are true. So that's something that defines that genre, that we're using like facts or real life as the source material for our narrative. So in literature, our genres are based on style, like prose versus poetry, but then on subject matter and plot elements as we sort of divide further. There's also historical periods of literature. So we might refer to a genre that describes literature written, in early American times or in different periods of history. So very brief overview of genres that we have in literature, and a lot of that's kind of where like the idea of like criticism and the canon and these things that we still kind of use. I don't know if they're useful all the time, but they do exist, and they do influence the way that we talk about video games today. Anyway, so in between those, we have film. Film is obviously a much newer medium than literature. It's only been around for 150 years, something like that. And film has even more like really specific genre conventions. So in film, we have action, adventure, comedy, crime, or gangster films. We have drama, epics. We have historical, so a lot of similarities, horror films, musical, dance, science fiction, war, westerns. There's probably more. I think those are the main ones, but all of those have like pretty specific conventions, right? Like if you have a crime movie, there's expectations that we have in terms of the plot, in terms of the things that are depicted, in terms of, maybe the morals that we see in the movie. I don't know if I think this link is just all the film genres. So yeah, we can see like the different film genres and then what we expect to see in those genres. So film genres reflect the setting as well as the theme and plot. So they bring setting more into it, and that's because obviously film is a visual medium, but it's also something that takes place in a real place. So you can't create a film without filming stuff, and usually you film on a location or in a specific place, and so that tells the audience something about the film. We have the same thing in games where we have a setting, and so we communicate to the audience where the game takes place using the visuals of the game, and that gives them sort of expectations about what the game will do. So most films fit into at least one or more of these categories. And there's another thing that gets kind of added in film, which is called the auteur system, or films that are made by a particular person or director or producer or studio. And that happens in literature to some extent. Obviously, you have authors that have a style and they publish the same books or whatever. In films, that kind of gets broadened out because many people work on a film. So similar to video games, you might have a whole series of video games that are published by one studio or one company. And they may be completely different games, but they might have some things in common. So you might say there's a similarity in these two games that are, in completely different genres. And so that's another way that we can kind of think about how these categories kind of affect the games that we play as well as the games that we might make. Okay, so moving on from film, we're almost done with this prehistory stuff. Talk a little bit about art. Art is a little bit different in the sense that the way that it's categorized, or the genres that we talk about, have to do with medium as well as historical movements. So you could kind of compare medium to like different styles in prose versus poetry and literature and stuff like that, but it is a little different because we have a bunch of different mediums in art that we can talk about. So you have drawing, painting, printmaking, sculpture, collage, textile, photography, film and video, performance, and multimedia. All these different mediums in art are the way that we kind of categorize or think about different genres of art. And so that's very different from the way that we think about literature and film, because they're basically using the same materials. And so we think about those genres in terms of the stories that they're telling, or the settings, or those different types of conventions. In art, we have different mediums. So we have completely, different stuff that we're making the art with, and the way that it looks and things like that, whether it takes place over time or it's just a painting on a wall. All of these things change the conventions of how we think about and also how we create art. There's also a lot of art tends to be grouped into historical periods, and this happens in our other media as well, but it's more pronounced in art, where we have the Renaissance, and we have these different periods of art that influence the way that we think about it. Did I want to say anything else about that? Well, this is just a link to periods in art history. We also have like different types of genres within mediums, like in painting. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. There's like history painting, where you paint scenes from history, portraits. Genre in art actually refers to scenes from everyday life, so that's a little confusing. Landscapes, still lives. We have these different styles of art that again create this other sort of like subtype of genre. So all of that is just kind of leading up to talking about video games. And so in video games, we have genres as well, but the thing that's different with video games than these other mediums is that we add this interactive component into the games. And that actually really has more to do with the types of video games that we talk about, what the interaction is or what the game system is, than necessarily like the setting or the historical period or other things. I guess we haven't had enough history for video games to have historical periods, although we do have retro games, so that is a historical period, but we don't have like hundreds of years worth of video games. So in video games, all of our main genres have to do with what we expect as an interaction and what we do in the game, rather than these other conventions like the setting or the plot or the goal of a work of literature or something like that. So for video games, our main genres are action, adventure, role-playing, simulation, strategy, casual, and massively multiplayer online. I guess there's probably some way we could pull that last one apart. But anyway, those are some of the main video game genres. Obviously, there's a lot of games that combine genres, that cross genres. That's very typical in games. But let's look at a few examples from these different genres and talk about what makes them, what makes these genres different. So here's a quote from an article that, I forgot to post this actually, but this is the research that you could do for this week if you want to read this article and write about it. So this is talking about sort of making decisions based on genre. And this article is a really good kind of overview of what we talk about when it comes to genre and different game genres, things like the audience, like thinking about the audience that expects different things from different genres and stuff like that. So I'll post that one. That's the research for this week. But a quote from here: video game genres are determined by gameplay, what challenges face the player, and what actions he takes to overcome those challenges. So we clearly have sports games, shooter games, racing games, and so on. I guess I didn't really need that last part. But anyway, that's the main point, is that game genres are not defined by their themes or their settings so much as they are by the challenges, the obstacles, the things that make the games playable. So for the action genre, typically when we think of an action game, what we think about are early simple arcade games where the gameplay is about timing and speed. So it's not necessarily about making decisions or thinking through puzzles. It's about reacting quickly and developing strategy very quickly. So timing and hand-eye coordination are a major part of that genre. So of course that's something that would never exist in poetry or prose or art. We're not, those mediums don't have timing. They don't have interaction, so they don't have hand-eye coordination. So that's an important component of the action genre. What makes it fun and what makes an action game, have action is this sense of timing and performance of the player. Real-time gameplay. So that means, the game engine is reacting into real time to what you're doing, and you're reacting to what the game engine is doing, and it's happening at a real-time pace. You don't have time to sit and think about your next move. Destroy enemies without dying. So yeah, I guess that's the main goal. There's like a typo in here. I need to update this. Anyway, I'm just gonna keep going. So Pong is like the best example of this. It's a really simple game. You're just like moving the paddle up and down. It's in real time, so the timing of the game system and your own physical ability to move the paddle is what makes the experience. And aspects of this genre, like these are the sort of the components of the genre, they come from things like technical limitations, like you can only draw with Pong, you can only draw so much on the screen, the player can only do so much with this like one little knob that they can move up and down. But by adding these components, very simple components together in this action setting, you could create a game that you could play forever. Like you could play this game all day, every day, and it would still have the same challenge. You might develop new strategies, but it would still, you can replay the game over and over again. So in that sense, this action type of video games are more similar to something like physical sports, like playing soccer or playing baseball, than they necessarily are to things like reading a book or going to the opera or something like that. And so games are kind of like an artistic medium. They combine visuals and art and storytelling and all these other things, but they also have this component to them that's like this physical performance. And so action games tend to have that. Pong is a good version or a good example of that. Another one is Miss Pac-Man. Just another game. There's a lot of, there's a little bit more going on. Like there's a bit more of a narrative. There's a bit more of like style. There's different colors. So there's a lot more going on in terms of the narrative framing than there is in something like Pong that's super simple. But the action is still about, quick reactions, quickly strategizing, using the controls and moving around on the screen. And so that's kind of the action genre. Okay, we'll talk about some action subgenres. I'm going to check the chat real quick. Yes, Tetris is an action type for sure. Oh, my internet died. Rose, is your internet okay? It looks like you're back. But we are recording, so you can always watch it later. Okay. So let's talk about action subgenres. So platformers, shooters, first-person, third-person shooters, racing games, fighting games. So, those are a lot of different types of games that all involve the components that we looked at up here. Real-time gameplay, timing, and hand-eye coordination. Those are kind of the main components. So Mario is our platformer example. Again, real-time gameplay, reacting to things that are happening in the scene in real time, timing, timing the right jump. All these things are part of the action genre. Okay, let's talk about the adventure genre. And a lot of games are categorized as action adventure, so these things are very often combined together. But adventure has to do more with like story. So early text-based games are considered adventure games. So games that don't have any action, any hand-eye coordination at all. Early text-based games like don't even have visuals, right? There's just like a story. You might have to travel. You might be playing a game where you have to make choices or travel, in a specific direction or look at different things. Or a lot of time they involve puzzles. But basically, the idea behind adventure is a narrative game where you're traveling through a world. So there's slower gameplay with puzzles, exploration, and story. Those are kind of the main things that typically an adventure game will be made of. Turn-based, so that's kind of like chess or something like that. You have your chance to make a turn, so you can think about what you want to do. You can make a choice and then enter your choice some way into the game system, and then it will react to that choice. Rogue is a good example of a early adventure game. I'll talk more about it in a little bit because it's a really interesting game. But it's an adventure-based game. So you have a story. It's turn-based. You kind of move around. You can collect different items, and you can fight different enemies. And there's a lot of like metrics and story and all these other things going on in the game. But at its core, it's an adventure. You're exploring this dungeon world, and you're trying to get all the way down to the bottom and all the way back up through one gameplay. So it has this narrative arc to it that makes it kind of this adventure. Action adventure, as we mentioned, these things get combined a lot. Combine real-time gameplay with story and puzzle elements. I guess I didn't have an example for that one. Role-playing games. So role-playing games tend to originate from Dungeons and Dragons, which I assume you guys are familiar with. At least some of you guys are probably familiar with. But the idea behind Dungeons and Dragons is that the characters create the story. So instead of having an author or a filmmaker or narrator tell the whole story, you have sort of a story shell that's created by a narrator or dungeon master or whoever is creating the experience. But then you have the players in the game actually create the narrative through their decisions and choices throughout the game. So a lot of role-playing games kind of borrow this concept from Dungeons and Dragons. Different players control characters or a group of characters, and the avatar is often an avatar for the real player. So you kind of create, you can design your character, or you create your attributes, or you choose from different characters with different attributes. There's an emphasis on gaining experience throughout the game. So in a lot of role-playing games, you'll kind of like level up as you complete different tasks, and you'll get more sort of like rewards or perks in the game, and you'll sort of understand the game world better and have more power, more ability in the game world. They tend to have full storylines, so they have like a lot of characters, a narrative arc with like a beginning, middle, and end, and lots of side stories and all these different. There's a lot of different like storytelling, like environmental storytelling is a big thing in role-playing games. So those are kind of the conventions of the role-playing genre. Final Fantasy obviously is like a good go-to thinking about a role-playing game where you have different characters that you choose from. You have quests. You kind of there are puzzles and fighting and things like within the game. There's sort of like these challenges within the game, but then there's this overarching story that you kind of go through. Simulation style games. You can probably think of some good examples of that, and we talked a little bit about simulation with our game settings last week as well. So in simulation, we're replicating aspects of a real-world experience. There are real-time, but there's also turn-based games, so they can use either. we have to. There's an application of real world rules. So the example of like a flight simulator that has simulation in the name. You're trying to recreate as closely as possible the experience of a real life thing, and then turn it into a game for people to experience. So Flight Simulator is a good example for this. It's not, it is a game, but it's made as faithful to real life as it can be in terms of the physics and the experience of flying a plane. So different types of simulation style games. Vehicle, like racing games or the flight simulator we just looked at. Process or construction and management, building civilization, strategy, stuff like Roller Coaster Tycoon or Civilization, those types of games where you're this kind of overseeing God who can do whatever they want and build stuff and place things in different places. So that's another type of simulation game. Sports like NBA 2K or FIFA, those types of games obviously are simulation. Now, next is the strategy genre. So strategy is based on classic games like Risk. One of the components is resource management. Decisions and goals are another big convention in strategy games. Warcraft 2 is an example of a strategy game where you can kind of control different characters. You have different resources, so you're always mining for resources so you can build different structures, and you have to kind of make decisions about what are the best things to build or how to organize the game so that you can win against a computer or in the world. Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, it just depends. Like, it could be 1 frame, it could be 30 frames. It depends on what you're going for. Yeah, uh, yeah, I think like 3 to 5 is probably good. But it just depends on like how realistic you want it to be, how many of these explosions are happening, at the same time. I think there's a bunch of ways you could go about it, but I think 3 to 5 is probably good enough to communicate an explosion. Yeah, 6 seems good. I think you'll know once you get there. I think a lot of the time you have to make something and then put it in the game and see how it looks, and then you'll see if it is too long or too short or how it needs to be adjusted. So, yep. Okay, massively multiplayer online games. So these are different because they involve multiple players, obviously. It could involve up to hundreds or thousands of players. You can play individual or in teams. And there's a social component to this style of game. So there might be social components to like an arcade game if there's 2 people playing. But there's another sort of like larger social interaction happening in this type of game where people are communicating, and they might not necessarily be communicating just about the game play or game strategy. They could just be communicating about their lives or about anything else that's going on. So that's a big aspect of that genre. And this again is combined with a lot of other types of games like first-person shooters or sports games or strategy games. EVE Online is a good example of this type of game where you have like lots of people all over the world who are kind of playing together, collaborating in this like really massive game world. Casual games are another Game genre whose conventions are kind of specific to the way that we interact with them. So they tend to be short and relaxing or meditative. They're actually not as much about the challenge, but they're more supposed to be kind of like not necessarily easy, but not as challenging, or not challenging in the same way where you're like having to do a lot of like difficult timing and hand-eye coordination. Casual games tend to be played on the browser or on your phone a lot these days. They involve puzzles, cards, word games, board games. Diner Dash is a good example of this, where you are kind of in charge of managing this diner, and so you have to get the dishes out, and you have to manage the customers or the patrons, and so there's strategy involved, and it combines other genres as well, but it's marketed. Part of it has to do with marketing. It's marketed towards people who don't want to necessarily play like a really expensive and all-consuming game. It's more of a casual experience. And then, so this last genre that I want to talk about is more kind of like a hyper-specific genre, which is a roguelike genre. And I think this one is really interesting in terms of like how it comes out of a specific type of technology. I mentioned Rogue a little bit earlier. I doubt that most of you guys have played Rogue, but maybe some of you have seen it or played it at some point. But it's a very early game from like 1980 or 82 or something like that. And it was developed and shared across like earlier versions of the internet. And because of that, the game needed to be really, really small in terms of the file size. In order to share it across like a really, really slow early version of the internet. They couldn't have like, games we have today that have like 60 gigabytes worth of 3D models and textures and things like that. So Rogue, the thing that they came up with in order to make the game really small and easy to distribute is they created procedurally generated levels. So there's no actual like finite levels in the game. Every time you play the game, all the levels are slightly different, and they involve a different sequence of events and different resources, different spells, and all the different things that are involved in the game. So they kind of defined what's possible in the game, and then they wrote a program that would generate a new game every time you play. And this created a whole genre of games. And it's really useful specifically for indie developers who don't necessarily have the time or resources to make a game with like 60 hours worth of levels and content like we might expect from a big studio or a AAA company. And so it allows somebody to create a game with a few basic ideas that still, you can play for as long as you want. Like every time you play Rogue, it's like playing chess or Pong or whatever. It's like a completely new experience just based on a few simple elements. And it was inspired by early text-based adventure games and interactive fiction. So it has a lot of those elements. There's a narrative to it. You kind of interact in the same way. There's resource management, there's a story, there's different monsters that you run into. So it borrows a lot of those kind of conventions from adventure games. And the few kind of conventions that they created, the procedural level generation, as well as some things that came out of that. So for example, if you die, that's the end of the game. So rather than having to save all of your progress, like a lot of games would save exactly where you were. In this game, if you die, that's it. You start over from the beginning. And that made it so you don't have to have these pre-baked levels, but it also makes the game a lot more intense because it's actually a very long game to play. And if you're playing for like 3 hours and then you die, it's a dramatic ending to the game. And so that kind of heightens the experience of the game. So these components or conventions of this type of game became known as a roguelike game, and they're really popular now with indie game development. If you go on like Itch or another indie game site and look for roguelike, you'll see a million of them. And there's also some that have become really popular. Binding of Isaac is one that's probably you guys would probably recognize that was very successful. So that's just an example. There's a lot more of sort of game genres like this, but an example of a specific game genre that came out of technical concerns, but also just the success of this one style of game kind of inspired or led to lots of games built in that style. There's also communities based around this game. Like there's this whole website is just like resources about how to create roguelike games and different styles of roguelike games. And so that's one of the cool things about video game genre is that it kind of leads to other things in that same genre. One video game is typically inspired by something that came before it and may inspire a lot of games that come afterwards. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, it's like people love these two games and putting them together, made that an even better experience, or maybe not better, but a cool experience. And that leads to more people creating that style of game. So yeah, that's a great example. So yeah, that's sort of game genre in a very quick nutshell. We can think about what type of games we are going to be making. We don't have a lot of limitations in terms of the style of game we want to make, but we do have limitations in terms of time, right? We can't make a game that's going to last 10 hours or 60 hours. We just have a semester to make it. So that may kind of factor into what we want to make, but we should think about what kind of genre do we like playing, and therefore what kind of genre are we inspired to actually create on our own. And once we kind of figure that out, we can think about what are the conventions of that genre. So if I am making a platformer, it's expected that I'm going to have a player with a certain number of lives, and if I get hit enough times, I'll lose those lives. So those are some conventions that you might want to just throw in. Or you might want to say, well, this is how it typically works, but maybe I can improve upon that, or maybe I can do something original that references that style. So as we start to think about the games that we want to create, we want to think about other games and what their conventions are and how we can either use those conventions, or we can also play with those conventions to create our own versions by combining things like in the example of Castlevania and Metroid, or improving on different ideas, or taking something that's not a video game like Dungeons and Dragons and turning it into a video game. All of these different concerns can help us think about how to create the video game, and also we also want to think again what people expect. So if you have a game with a bunch of zombies in it, that's going to create an expectation for your player as to how those zombies act. And so you can use those conventions, or you can kind of play with them. So yeah, any questions? Oh yeah, Dead Cells is really good. Yeah. No. Is it about games? Hmm. Oh, so it's like a documentary. Oh, cool. That's pretty cool. I didn't know about that. I'll have to check that out. Oh, wow. Yeah, this looks really interesting. Very cool. Awesome. I'll check that out. Cool. I'm gonna